The Yosemite by John Muir. Chapter 6, Part C. The Two-Leaved Pine. The two-leaved pine, Pinus contorta, variety Murrayana, above the silver fir zone, forms the bulk of the alpine forests up to a height of from 8,000 to 9,500 feet above the sea, growing in beautiful order on moraines scarcely changed as yet by post-glacial weathering. Compared with the giants of the lower regions, this is a small tree, seldom exceeding a height of 80 or 90 feet. The largest I ever measured was 90 feet high and a little over 6 feet in diameter. The average height of mature trees throughout the entire belt is probably not far from 50 or 60 feet with a diameter of 2 feet. It is a well-proportioned, rather handsome tree, with grayish-brown bark and crooked, much-divided branches which cover the greater part of the trunk, but not so densely as to prevent it being seen. The lower limbs, like those of most other conifers that grow in snowy regions, curve downward, gradually take a horizontal position about halfway up the trunk, then aspire more and more toward the summit. The short, rigid needles and fascicles of two are arranged in comparatively long cylindrical tassels at the ends of the tough, up-curving branches. The cones are about 2 inches long, growing in clusters among the needles, without any striking effect except while very young, when the flowers are of a vivid crimson color, and the whole tree appears to be dotted with brilliant flowers. The staminate flowers are still more showy on account of their great abundance, often giving a reddish-yellow tinge to the whole mass of foliage, and filling the air with pollen. No other pine on the range is so regularly planted as this one, covering moraines that extend along the sides of the high rocky valleys for miles without interruption. The thin bark is streaked and sprinkled with resin, as though it had been showered upon the forest like rain. Therefore this tree more than any other is subject to destruction by fire. During strong winds extensive forests are destroyed, the flames leaping from tree to tree in continuous belts that go surging and racing onward above the bending wood like prairie-grass fires. During the calm season of Indian summer the fire creeps quietly along the ground, feeding on needles and cones. Arriving at the foot of a tree, the resiny bark is ignited and the heated air ascends in a swift current, increasing in velocity and dragging the flames upward. Then the leaves catch, forming an immense column of fire, beautifully spired on the edges and tinted a rose-purple hue. It rushes aloft 30 or 40 feet above the top of the tree, forming a grand spectacle, especially at night. It lasts, however, only a few seconds, vanishing with magical rapidity, to be succeeded by others along the fire line at irregular intervals, tree after tree, upflashing and darting, leaving the trunks and branches scarcely scarred. The heat, however, is sufficient to kill the tree, and in a few years the bark shrivels and falls off. Forests miles in extent are thus killed and left standing, with the branches on, but peeled and rigid, appearing gray in the distance like misty clouds. Later the branches drop off, leaving a forest of bleached spars. At length the roots decay and the forlorn gray trunks are blown down during some storm and piled one upon another, encumbering the ground until, dry and seasoned, they are consumed by another fire and leave the ground ready for a fresh crop. In sheltered lake hollows, on beds of alluvium, this pine varies so far from the common form that frequently it could be taken for a distinct species, growing in damp sods like grasses from 40 to 80 feet high, bending all together to the breeze and whirling in eddying gusts more lively than any other tree in the woods. I frequently found specimens 50 feet high less than 5 inches in diameter. Being so slender and at the same time clad with leafy boughs, it is often bent and weighed down to the ground when laden with soft snow, thus forming fine ornamental arches, many of them to last until the melting of the snow in the spring. The Mountain Pine. The mountain pine, Pinus monticola, is the noblest tree of the alpine zone, hardy and long-lived, towering grandly above its companions and becoming stronger and more imposing just where other species begin to crouch and disappear. At its best it is usually about 90 feet high, and 5 or 6 feet in diameter, though you may find specimens here and there considerably larger than this. It is as massive and suggestive of enduring strength as an oak. About 2/3 of the trunk is commonly free of limbs, but close fringy tufts of spray occur nearly all the way down to the ground. On trees that occupy exposed situations near its upper limit, the bark is deep reddish brown and rather deeply furrowed, the main furrows running nearly parallel to each other and connected on the old trees by conspicuous cross furrows. The cones are from 4 to 8 inches long, smooth, slender, cylindrical, and somewhat curved. They grow in clusters of from 3 to 6 or 7, and become pendulous as they increase in weight. This species is nearly related to the sugar pine, and, though not half so tall, it suggests its noble relative in the way that it extends its long branches in general habit. It is first met on the upper margin of the silver fir zone, singly in what appears as chance situations, without making much impression on the general forest. Continuing up through the forests of the two-leaved pine, it begins to show its distinguishing characteristic in the most marked way at an elevation of about 10,000 feet, extending its tough, rather slender arms in the frosty air, welcoming the storms and feeding on them, and reaching sometimes to the grand old age of 1,000 years. The Western Juniper. The juniper, or red cedar (Juniperus occidentalis), is preeminently a rock tree, occupying the baldest domes and pavements in the upper silver fir and alpine zones, at a height of from 7,000 to 9,500 feet. In such situations, rooted in narrow cracks or fissures, where there is scarcely a handful of soil, it is frequently over 8 feet in diameter, and not much more in height. The tops of old trees are almost always dead, and large stubborn-looking limbs push out horizontally, most of them broken and dead at the end, but densely covered, and embedded here and there with tufts or mounds of gray-green scale-like foliage. Some trees are mere storm-beaten stumps about as broad as long, decorated with a few leafy sprays, reminding one of the crumbling towers of old castles scantily draped with ivy. Its homes on bare, barren dome and ridge top seem to have been chosen for safety against fire, for, on isolated mounds of sand and gravel free from grass and bushes on which fire could feed, it is often found growing tall and unscathed to a height of 40 to 60 feet, with scarce a trace of the rocky angularity and broken limbs so characteristic a feature throughout the greater part of its range. It never makes anything like a forest, seldom even a grove. Usually it stands out separate and independent, clinging by slight joints to the rocks, living chiefly on snow and thin air, and maintaining sound health on this diet for 2,000 years or more. Every feature or every gesture it makes expresses steadfast, dogged endurance. The bark is of a bright cinnamon color, and is handsomely braided and reticulated on thrifty trees, flaking off in thin, shining ribbons that are sometimes used by the Indians for tent matting. Its fine color and picturesqueness are appreciated by artists, but to me the juniper seems a singularly strange and taciturn tree. I have spent many a day and night in its company, and have always found it silent and rigid. It seems to be a survivor of some ancient race, wholly unacquainted with its neighbors. Its broad stumpiness, of course, makes wind-waving or even shaking out of the question, but it is not this rocky rigidity that constitutes its silence. In calm Sundays the sugar pine preaches like an enthusiastic apostle without moving a leaf. On level rocks the juniper dies standing, and wastes insensibly out of existence like granite, the wind exerting about as little control over it, alive or dead, as it does over a glacier boulder. I have spent a good deal of time trying to determine the age of these wonderful trees, but as all of the very old ones are honeycombed with dry rot, I never was able to get a complete count of the largest. Some are undoubtedly more than 2,000 years old, for though on deep moraine soil, they grow about as fast as some of the pines. On bare pavements and smoothly glaciated, overswept ridges in the dome region, they grow very slowly. One on the Star King Ridge, only 2 feet 11 inches in diameter, was 1,140 years old 40 years ago. Another on the same ridge, only 1 foot 7½ inches in diameter, had reached the age of 834 years. The first 15 inches from the bark of a medium-sized tree 6 feet in diameter on the North Tenaya pavement had 859 layers of wood. Beyond this the count was stopped by dry rot and scars. The largest examined was 33 feet in girth, or nearly 10 feet in diameter, and, although I have failed to get anything like a complete count, I learned enough from this and many other specimens to convince me that most of the trees 8 or 10 feet thick, standing on pavements, are more than 20 centuries old rather than less. Barring accidents, for all I can see, they would live forever. Even then, overthrown by avalanches, they refuse to lie at rest, lean stubbornly on their big branches as if anxious to rise, and while a single root holds to the rock, put forth fresh leaves with a grim, never-say-die expression. End of Chapter 6, Part C. The Yosemite, by John Muir. Chapter 6, Part D. The Mountain Hemlock. As the juniper is the most stubborn and unshakable of trees in the Yosemite region, the mountain hemlock, Tsuga mertensiana, is the most graceful and pliant and sensitive. Until it reaches a height of 50 or 60 feet, it is sumptuously clothed down to the ground with drooping branches, which are divided again and again into delicate waving sprays, grouped and arranged in ways that are indescribably beautiful, and profusely adorned with small brown cones. The flowers are also peculiarly beautiful and effective, the female dark rich purple, the male blue, of so fine and pure a tone that the best azure of the mountain sky seems to be condensed in them. Though apparently the most delicate and feminine of all the mountain trees, it grows best where the snow lies deepest, at a height of from 9,000 to 9,500 feet, in hollows on the northern slopes of mountains and ridges. But under all circumstances, sheltered from heavy winds or in bleak exposure to them, well fed or starved, even at its highest limit 10,500 feet above the sea, on exposed ridge tops where it has to crouch and huddle close in low thickets, it still contrives to put forth its sprays and branches in forms of invincible beauty, while on moist, well-drained moraines it displays a perfectly tropical luxuriance of foliage, flowers, and fruit. The snow of the first winter storm is frequently soft and lodges in dew-dense leafy branches, weighing them down against the trunk, and the slender drooping axis, bending lower and lower as the load increases, at length reaches the ground, forming an ornamental arch. Then, as storm succeeds storm and snow is heaped on snow, the whole tree is at last buried, not again to see the light of day or move leaf or limb until set free by the spring thaws in June or July. Not only the youngest saplings are thus carefully covered and put to sleep in the whitest of white beds for 5 or 6 months of the year, but trees 30 feet high or more. From April to May, when the snow by repeated thawing and freezing is firmly compacted, you may ride over the prostrate groves without seeing a single branch or leaf of them. No other of our alpine conifers so finely veils its strength. Poised in thin white sunshine, clad with branches from head to foot, it towers in unassuming majesty, drooping as if unaffected with the aspiring tendencies of its race, loving the ground, conscious of heaven and joyously receptive of its blessings, reaching out its branches like sensitive tentacles, feeling the light and reveling in it. The largest specimen I ever found was 19 feet 7 inches in circumference. It was growing on the edge of Lake Hollow, north of Mount Hoffman, at an elevation of 9,250 feet above the level of the sea, and was probably about 100 feet in height. Fine groves of mature trees, 90 to 100 feet in height, are growing near the base of Mount Conness. It is widely distributed from near the south extremity of the High Sierra northward along the Cascade Mountains of Oregon and Washington and the Coast Ranges of British Columbia to Alaska, where it was first discovered in 1827. Its northernmost limit, so far as I have observed, is in the icy fjords of Prince William Sound in latitude 61 degrees, where it forms pure forests at the level of the sea, growing tall and majestic on the banks of glaciers. There, as in the Yosemite region, it is ineffably beautiful, the very loveliest of all the American conifers. The white bark pine. The dwarf pine, or white bark pine (Pinus albicaulis), forms the extreme edge of the timberline throughout nearly the whole extent of the range on both flanks. It is first met growing with the two-leaved pine on the upper margin of the alpine belt, as an erect tree from 15 to 30 feet high and from 1 to 2 feet in diameter, hence it goes straggling up the flanks of the summit peaks, upon moraines or crumbling ledges, wherever it can get a foothold, to an elevation of from 10,000 to 12,000 feet, where it dwarfs to a mass of crumpled branches, covered with slender shoots, each tipped with a short, close-packed leaf tassel. The bark is smooth and purplish, in some places almost white. The flowers are bright scarlet and rose purple, giving a very flowery appearance little looked for in such a tree. The cones are about 3 inches long, 1.5 inches in diameter, grow in rigid clusters, and are dark chocolate in color while young, and bear beautiful pearly white seeds about the size of peas, most of which are eaten by chipmunks and the Clark's crows. Pines are commonly regarded as sky-loving trees that must necessarily aspire or die. This species forms a marked exception, crouching and creeping in compliance with the most rigorous demands of climate, yet enduring bravely to a more advanced age than many of its lofty relatives in the sunlands far below it. Seen from a distance, it would never be taken for a tree of any kind. For example, on Cathedral Peak there is a scattered growth of this pine, creeping like mosses over the roof, nowhere giving hint of an ascending axis. While, approached quite near, it still appears matty and healthy, and one experiences no difficulty in walking over the top of it, yet it is seldom absolutely prostrate, usually attaining a height of 3 or 4 feet, with a main trunk, and with branches outspread above it, as if in ascending they had been checked by a ceiling against which they had been compelled to spread horizontally. The winter snow is a sort of ceiling, lasting half the year, while the pressed surface is made yet smoother by violent winds armed with cutting sand grains that bear down any shoot which offers to rise much above the general level, and that carve the dead trunks and branches in beautiful patterns. During stormy nights I have often camped snugly beneath the interlacing arches of this little pine. The needles, which have accumulated for centuries, make fine beds, a fact well known to other mountaineers, such as deer and wild sheep, who paw out oval hollows and lie beneath the larger trees in safe and comfortable concealment. This lowly dwarf reaches a far greater age than would be guessed. A specimen that I examined, growing at an elevation of 10,700 feet, yet looked as though it might be plucked up by the roots, for it was only 3.5 inches in diameter, and its topmost tassel reached hardly 3 feet above the ground. Cutting it half through and counting the annual rings with the aid of a lens, I found its age to be no less than 255 years. Another specimen about the same height, with a trunk 6 inches in diameter, I found to be 426 years old 40 years ago, and one of its supple branchlets, hardly 1/8 of an inch in diameter inside the bark, was 75 years old, and so filled with oily balsam and seasoned by storms that I tied it in knots like a whipcord. The nut pine. In going across the range from the Tuolumne River Soda Springs to Mono Lake, one makes the acquaintance of the curious little nut pine, Pinus monophylla. It dots the eastern flank of the Sierra, to which it is mostly restricted in grayish bush-like patches, from the margin of the sage plains to an elevation of from 7,000 to 8,000 feet. A more contented, fruitful, and unaspiring conifer could not be conceived. All the species we have been sketching make departures more or less distant from the typical spire form, but none goes so far as this. Without any apparent cause, it keeps near the ground, throwing out crooked, divergent branches, like an orchard apple tree, and seldom pushes a single shoot higher than 15 or 20 feet above the ground. The average thickness of the trunk is, perhaps, about 10 or 12 inches. The leaves are mostly undivided, like round awls, instead of being separated, like those of other pines, into 2s and 3s and 5s. The cones are green while growing, and are usually found all over the tree, forming quite a marked feature as seen against the bluish-gray foliage. They are quite small, only about 2 inches in length, and seem to have but little space for seeds. But when we come to open them, we find that about half the entire bulk of the cone is made up of sweet, nutritious nuts, nearly as large as hazelnuts. This is undoubtedly the most important food tree on the Sierra, and furnishes the Mona, Carson, and Walker River Indians with more and better nuts than all the other species taken together. It is the Indians' own tree, and many a white man have they killed for cutting it down. Being so low, the cones are readily beaten off with poles, and the nuts procured by roasting them until the scales open. In bountiful seasons, a single Indian may gather 30 or 40 bushels. End of Chapter 6, Part D.
The Yosemite by John Muir. Chapter 7. The Big Trees. Between the heavy pine and silver fir zones towers the big tree, Sequoia gigantea, the king of all the conifers in the world, the noblest of the noble race. The groves nearest Yosemite Valley are about 20 miles to the westward and southward and are called the Tuolumne, Merced, and Mariposa groves. It extends, a widely interrupted belt, from a very small grove on the middle fork of the American River to the head of Deer Creek, a distance of about 260 miles, its northern limit being near the 39th parallel, the southern a little below the 36th. The elevation of the belt above the sea varies from about 5,000 to 8,000 feet. From the American River to Kings River the species occurs only in small isolated groups, so sparsely distributed along the belt that 3 of the gaps in it are from 40 to 60 miles wide. But from Kings River southward the sequoia is not restricted to mere groves, but extends across the wide rugged basins of the Kaweah and Tule rivers in noble forests, a distance of nearly 70 miles, the continuity of this part of the belt being broken only by the main canyons. The Fresno, the largest of the northern groves, has an area of 3 or 4 square miles, a short distance to the southward of the famous Mariposa Grove. Along the south rim of the canyon of the South Fork of Kings River there is a majestic sequoia forest about 6 miles long by 2 wide. This is the northernmost group that may fairly be called a forest. Descending the divide between the Kings and Kaweah rivers you come to the grand forests that form the main continuous portion of the belt. Southward the giants become more and more irrepressibly exuberant, heaving their massive crowns into the sky from every ridge and slope, waving onward in graceful compliance with the complicated topography of the region. The finest of the Kaweah section of the belt is on the broad ridge between Marble Creek and the Middle Fork, and is called the Giant Forest. It extends from the granite headlands, overlooking the hot San Joaquin Plains, to within a few miles of the cool glacial fountains of the summit peaks. The extreme upper limit of the belt is reached between the middle and south forks of the Kaweah at a height of 8,400 feet. But the finest block of big tree forests in the entire belt is on the north fork of Tule River, and is included in the Sequoia National Park. In the northern groves there are comparatively few young trees or saplings, but here for every old storm-beaten giant there are many in their prime, and for each of these a crowd of hopeful young trees and saplings, growing vigorously on moraines, rocky edges, along watercourses and meadows. But though the area occupied by the big tree increases so greatly from north to south, here is no marked increase in the size of the trees. The height of 275 feet or thereabouts, and a diameter of about 20 feet, 4 feet from the ground is, perhaps, about the average size of what may be called full-grown trees, where they are favorably located. The specimens 25 feet in diameter are not very rare, and a few are nearly 300 feet high. In the Calaveras Grove there are 4 trees over 300 feet in height, the tallest of which, as measured by the Geological Survey, is 325 feet. The very largest that I have yet met in the course of my explorations is a majestic old fire-scarred monument in the Kings River forest. It is 35 feet and 8 inches in diameter inside the bark, 4 feet above the ground. It is burned half through, and I spent a day in clearing away the charred surface with a sharp axe and counting the annual wood rings with the aid of a pocket lens. I succeeded in laying bare a section all the way from the outside to the heart, and counted a little over 4,000 rings, showing that this tree was in its prime about 27 feet in diameter at the beginning of the Christian era. No other tree in the world, as far as I know, has looked down on so many centuries as the sequoia, or opened so many impressive and suggestive views into history. Under the most favorable conditions these giants probably live 5,000 years or more, though few of even the larger trees are half as old. The age of one that was felled in Calaveras Grove, for the sake of having its stump for a dancing floor, was about 1,300 years, and its diameter measured across the stump 24 feet inside the bark. Another that was felled in the Kings River forest was about the same size but nearly 1,000 years older, 2,200 years, though not a very old-looking tree. So harmonious and finely balanced are even the mightiest of these monarchs in all their proportions, that there is never anything overgrown or monstrous about them. Seeing them for the first time you are more impressed with their beauty than their size, their grandeur being in great part invisible. But sooner or later it becomes manifest to the loving eye, stealing slowly on the senses like the grandeur of Niagara or of the Yosemite domes. When you approach them and walk around them you begin to wonder at their colossal size and try to measure them. They bulge considerably at the base, but not more than is required for beauty and safety, and the only reason that this bulging seems in some cases excessive is that only a comparatively small section is seen in near views. One that I measured in the Kings River forest was 25 feet in diameter at the ground and 10 feet in diameter 220 feet above the ground, showing the fineness of the taper of the trunk as a whole. No description can give anything like an adequate idea of their singular majesty, much less of their beauty. Except the sugar pine, most of their neighbors with pointed tops seem ever trying to go higher, while the big tree, soaring above them all, seems satisfied. Its grand domed head seems to be poised about as lightly as a cloud, giving no impression of seeking to rise higher. Only when it is young does it show like other conifers a heavenward yearning, sharply aspiring with a long, quick-growing top. Indeed, the whole tree for the first century or two, or until it is 100 or 150 feet high, is arrowhead in form, and compared with the solemn rigidity of age, seems as sensitive to the wind as a squirrel's tail. As it grows older, the lower branches are gradually dropped and the upper ones thinned out until comparatively few are left. These, however, are developed to a great size, divide again and terminate in bossy, rounded masses of leafy branchlets, while the head becomes dome-shaped, and is the first to feel the touch of the rosy beams of the morning, the last to bid the sun good night. Perfect specimens, unhurt by running fires or lightning, are singularly regular and symmetrical in general form, though not in the least conventionalized, for they show extraordinary variety in the unity and harmony of their general outline. The immensely strong, stately shafts are free of limbs for 150 feet or so. The large limbs reach out with equal boldness in every direction, showing no weather side, and no other tree has foliage so densely massed, so finely molded in outline and so perfectly subordinate to an ideal type. A particularly knotty, angular, ungovernable-looking branch, from 5 to 7 or 8 feet in diameter, and perhaps 1,000 years old, may occasionally be seen pushing out from the trunk as if determined to break across the bounds of the regular curve, but like all the others it dissolves in bosses of branchlets and sprays as soon as the general outline is approached. Except in picturesque old age, after being struck by lightning or broken by thousands of snowstorms, the regularity of forms is one of their most distinguishing characteristics. Another is the simple beauty of the trunk and its great thickness as compared with its height and the width of the branches, which makes them look more like finely modeled and sculptured architectural columns than the stems of trees, while the great limbs look like rafters, supporting the magnificent dome head. But though so consummately beautiful, the big tree always seems unfamiliar, with peculiar physiognomy, awfully solemn and earnest. Yet with all its strangeness it impresses us as being more at home than any of its neighbors, holding the best right to the ground as the oldest, strongest inhabitant. One soon becomes acquainted with new species of pine and fir and spruce as with friendly people, shaking their outstretched branches like shaking hands and fondling their little ones, while the venerable aboriginal sequoia, ancient of other days, keeps you at a distance, looking as strange in aspect and behavior among its neighbor trees as would the mastodon among the homely bears and deers. Only the Sierra juniper is at all like it, standing rigid and unconquerable on glacier pavements for thousands of years, grim and silent, with an air of antiquity about as pronounced as that of the sequoia. The bank of the largest trees is from 1 to 2 feet thick, rich cinnamon brown, purplish on young trees, forming magnificent masses of colors with the underbrush. Toward the end of winter the trees are in bloom, while the snow is still 8 or 10 feet deep. The female flowers are about 3/8 of an inch long, pale green, and grow in countless thousands on the ends of sprays. The male are still more abundant, pale yellow, 1/4 of an inch long, and when the pollen is ripe they color the whole tree and dust the air and the ground. The cones are bright grass green in color, about 2½ inches long, 1½ wide, made up of 30 or 40 strong, closely packed rhomboidal scales, with 4 to 8 seeds at the base of each. The seeds are wonderfully small and light, being only from 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch long and wide, including a filmy surrounding wing, which causes them to glint and waver in falling, and enables the wind to carry them considerable distances. Unless harvested by the squirrels, the cones discharge their seeds and remain on the tree for many years. In fruitful seasons the trees are fairly laden. On 2 small branches, 1½ and 2 inches in diameter, I counted 480 cones. No other California conifer produces nearly so many seeds, except, perhaps, the other sequoia, the redwood of the coast mountains. Millions are ripened annually by a single tree, and in a fruitful year the product of one of the northern groves would be enough to plant all the mountain ranges in the world. As soon as any accident happens to the crown, such as being smashed off by lightning, the branches beneath the wound, no matter how situated, seem to be excited, like a colony of bees that have lost their queen, and become anxious to repair the damage. Limbs that have grown outward for centuries at right angles to the trunk begin to turn upward to assist in making a new crown, each speedily assuming the special form of true summits. Even in the case of mere stumps burned half through, some mere ornamental tuft will try to go aloft and do its best as a leader in forming a new head. Groups of 2 or 3 are often found standing close together, the seeds from which they sprang having probably grown on ground cleared for their reception by the fall of a large tree of a former generation. They are called loving couples, 3 graces, etc. When these trees are young they are seen to stand 20 or 30 feet apart. By the time they are full grown their trunks will touch and crowd against each other and in some cases even appear as one. It is generally believed that the sequoia was once far more widely distributed over the Sierra, but after long and careful study I have come to the conclusion that it never was, at least since the close of the glacial period, because a diligent search along the margins of the groves and in the gaps between fails to reveal a single trace of its previous existence beyond its present bounds. Notwithstanding, I feel confident that if every sequoia in the range were to die today, numerous monuments of their existence would remain, of so imperishable a nature as to be available for the student more than 10,000 years hence. In the first place, no species of coniferous tree in the range keeps its members so well together as the sequoia. A mile is, perhaps, the greatest distance of any straggler from the main body, and all of those stragglers that have come under my observation are young, instead of old monumental trees, relics of a more extended growth. Again, the trunks of the sequoia last for centuries after they fall. I have a specimen block of sequoia wood, cut from a fallen tree, which is hardly distinguishable from a similar section cut from a living tree, although the one cut from the fallen trunk has certainly lain on the damp forest floor more than 380 years, probably thrice as long. The time measure in the case is simply this. When the ponderous trunk to which the old vestige belonged fell, it sunk itself into the ground, thus making a long, straight ditch, and in the middle of this ditch a silver fir 4 feet in diameter and 380 years old was growing, as I determined by cutting it half through and counting the rings, thus demonstrating that the remnant of the trunk that made the ditch has lain on the ground more than 380 years. For it is evident that, to find the whole time, we must add to the 380 years the time that the vanished portion of the trunk lay in the ditch before being burned out of the way, plus the time that passed before the seed from which the monumental fir sprang fell into the prepared soil and took root. Now, because the sequoia trunks are never wholly consumed in one forest fire, and those fires recur only at considerable intervals, and because sequoia ditches after being cleared are often left unplanted for centuries, it becomes evident that the trunk remnant in question may probably have lain 1,000 years or more, and this instance is by no means a late one. Again, admitting that upon those areas supposed to have been once covered with sequoia forests, every tree may have fallen, and every trunk may have been burnt or buried, leaving not a remnant, many of the ditches made by the fall of the ponderous trunks, and the bowls made by their upturning roots, would remain patent for thousands of years after the last vestige of the trunks that made them had vanished. Much of this ditch-writing would no doubt be quickly effaced by the flood action of overflowing streams and rain-washing, but no inconsiderable portion would remain enduringly engraved on ridge-tops beyond such destructive action, for where all the conditions are favorable, it is almost imperishable. Now these historic ditches and root bowls occur in the present sequoia groves and forests, but as far as I have observed, not the faintest vestige of one presents itself outside of them. We therefore conclude that the area covered by sequoia has not been diminished during the last 8,000 or 10,000 years, and probably not at all in post-glacial time. Nevertheless, the questions may be asked. Is the species verging toward extinction? What are its relations to climate, soil, and associated trees? All the phenomena bearing on these questions also throw light, as we shall endeavor to show, upon the peculiar distribution of the species, and sustain the conclusion already arrived at, as to the question of former extension. In the northern groups, as we have seen, there are few young trees or saplings growing up around the old ones to perpetuate the race, and inasmuch as those aged sequoias, so nearly childless, are the only ones commonly known, the species, to most observers, seems doomed to speedy extinction, as being nothing more than an expiring remnant, vanquished in the so-called struggle for life by pines and firs that have driven it into its last strongholds in moist glens where the climate is supposed to be exceptionally favorable. But the story told by the majestic continuous forests of the south creates a very different impression. No tree in the forest is more enduringly established in concordance with both climate and soil. It grows heartily everywhere, on moraines, rocky ledges, along watercourses, and in the deep, moist alluvium of meadows with, as we have seen, a multitude of seedlings and saplings crowding up around the aged, abundantly able to maintain the forest in prime vigor. So that if all the trees of any section of the main sequoia forest were ranged together according to age, a very promising curve would be presented, all the way up from last year's seedlings to giants, and with the young and middle-aged portion of the curve many times longer than the old portion. Even as far north as the Fresno, I counted 536 saplings and seedlings growing promisingly upon a landslip not exceeding 2 acres in area. This soil bed was about 7 years old, and had been seeded almost simultaneously by pines, firs, libocedrus, and sequoia, presenting a simple and instructive illustration of the struggle for life among the rival species. And it was interesting to note that the conditions thus far affecting them have enabled the young sequoias to gain a marked advantage. Toward the south, where the sequoia becomes most exuberant and numerous, the rival trees become less so, and where they mix with sequoias they grow up beneath them like slender grasses among stalks of Indian corn. Upon a bed of sandy flood soil I counted 94 sequoias, from 1 to 12 feet high, on a patch of ground once occupied by 4 large sugar pines, which lay crumbling beneath them, an instance of conditions which have enabled sequoias to crowd out the pines. I also noted 86 vigorous saplings upon a piece of fresh ground prepared for their reception by fire. Thus fire, the great destroyer of the sequoia, also furnishes the bare ground required for its growth from the seed. Fresh ground is, however, furnished in sufficient quantities for the renewal of the forest without the aid of fire, by the fall of old trees. The soil is thus upturned and mellowed, and many trees are planted for every one that falls. It is constantly asserted in a vague way that the Sierra was vastly wetter than now, and that the increasing drought will of itself extinguish the sequoia, leaving its ground to other trees supposed capable of flourishing in a drier climate. But that the sequoia can and does grow on as dry ground as any of its present rivals is manifest in 1,000 places. Why, then, it will be asked, are sequoias always found only in well-watered places? Simply because a growth of sequoias creates those streams. The thirsty mountaineer knows well that in every sequoia grove he will find running water. But it is a mistake to suppose that the water is the cause of the grove being there. On the contrary, the grove is the cause of the water being there. Drain off the water and the trees will remain, but cut off the trees and the streams will vanish. Never was cause more completely mistaken for effect than in the case of these related phenomena of sequoia woods and perennial streams. When attention is called to the method of sequoia stream making, it will be apprehended at once. The roots of this immense tree fill the ground, forming a thick sponge that absorbs and holds back the rain and melting snow, only allowing it to ooze and flow gently. Indeed, every fallen leaf and rootlet, as well as long clasping root and prostrate trunk, may be regarded as a dam hoarding the bounty of storm clouds and dispensing it as blessings all through the summer, instead of allowing it to go headlong into short-lived floods. Since, then, it is a fact that thousands of sequoias are growing thriftily on what is termed dry ground, and even clinging like mountain pines to rifts in granite precipices, and since it has always been shown that the extra moisture found in connection with the denser growths is an effect of their presence, instead of a cause of their presence, then the notions as to the former extension of the species and its near approach to extinction, based upon its supposed dependence on greater moisture, are seen to be erroneous. The decrease in rain and snowfall since the close of the glacial period in the Sierra is much less than is commonly guessed. The highest postglacial watermarks are well preserved in all the upper river channels, and they are not greatly higher than the spring flood marks of the present, showing conclusively that no extraordinary decrease has taken place in the volume of the upper tributaries of postglacial Sierra streams since they came into existence. But in the meantime, eliminating all this complicated question of climate change, the plain fact remains that the present rain and snowfall is abundantly sufficient for the luxuriant growth of sequoia forests. Indeed, all my observations tend to show that in a prolonged drought the sugar pines and firs would perish before the sequoia, not alone because of the greater longevity of the individual trees, but because the species can endure more drought and make the most of whatever moisture falls. Again, if the restriction and irregular distribution of the species be interpreted as a result of the desiccation of the range, then instead of increasing as it does in individuals toward the south where the rainfall is less, it should diminish. If, then, the peculiar distribution of sequoia has not been governed by superior conditions of soil as to fertility or moisture, by what has it been governed? In the course of my studies I observed that the northern groves, the only ones I was at first acquainted with, were located on just those portions of the general forest soil belt that were first laid bare toward the close of the glacial period when the ice sheet began to break up into individual glaciers. And while searching the wide basin of the San Joaquin and trying to account for the absence of sequoia where every condition seemed favorable for its growth, it occurred to me that this remarkable gap in the sequoia belt 50 miles wide is located exactly in the basin of the vast, ancient mer de glace of the San Joaquin and Kings River basins, which poured its frozen floods to the plain through this gap as its channel. I then perceived that the next great gap in the belt to the northward, 40 miles wide, extending between the Calaveras and Tuolumne groves, occurs in the basin of the great ancient mer de glace of the Tuolumne and Stanislaus basins, and that the smaller gap between the Merced and Mariposa groves occurs in the basin of the smaller glacier of the Merced. The wider the ancient glacier, the wider the corresponding gap in the Sequoia belt. Finally, pursuing my investigations across the basins of the Kaweah and Tule, I discovered that the Sequoia belt attained its great development just where, owing to the topographical peculiarities of the region, the ground had been best protected from the main ice rivers that continued to pour past from the summit fountains long after the smaller local glaciers had been melted. Taking now a general view of the belt, beginning at the south, we see that the majestic ancient glaciers were shed off right and left down the valleys of Kern and King's rivers by the lofty protective spurs outspread embracingly above the warm sequoia-filled basins of the Kaweah and Tule. Then next northward occurs the wide sequoialess channel, or basin of the ancient San Joaquin and Sings River Mer de Glace, then the warm protected spots of Fresno and Mariposa groves, then the sequoialess channel of the ancient Merced Glacier. Next the warm, sheltered ground of the Merced and Tuolumne groves, then the sequoialess channel of the grand ancient Mer de Glace of the Tuolumne and Stanislaus, then the warm old ground of the Calaveras and Stanislaus groves. It appears, therefore, that just where, at a certain period in the history of the Sierra, the glaciers were not, there the sequoia is, and just where the glaciers were, there the sequoia is not. But although all the observed phenomena bearing on the post-glacial history of this colossal tree point to the conclusion that it never was more widely distributed on the Sierra since the close of the glacial epoch, that its present forests are scarcely past prime, if indeed they have reached prime, that the post-glacial day of the species is probably not half done. Yet, when from a wider outlook the vast antiquity of the genus is considered, and its ancient richness in species and individuals, comparing our Sierra giant and Sequoia sempervirens of the Coast Range, the only other living species of sequoia, with the 12 fossil species already discovered and described by Hare and Lescureux, some of which flourished over vast areas in the Arctic regions and in Europe and our own territories during Tertiary and Cretaceous times, then indeed it becomes plain that our two surviving species, restricted to narrow belts within the limits of California, are mere remnants of the genus, both as to species and individuals, and that they may be verging to extinction. But the verge of a period beginning in Cretaceous times may have a breadth of tens of thousands of years, not to mention the possible existence of conditions calculated to multiply and re-extend both species and individuals. There is no absolute limit to the existence of any tree. Death is due to accidents, not, as that of animals, to the wearing out of organs. Only the leaves die of old age. Their fall is foretold in their structure, but the leaves are renewed every year, and so also are the essential organs, wood, roots, bark, and buds. Most of the Sierra trees die of disease, insects, fungi, etc., but nothing hurts the big tree. I never saw one that was sick or showed the slightest sign of decay. Barring accidents, it seems to be immortal. It is a curious fact that all the very old sequoias had lost their heads by lightning strokes. All things come to him who waits. But of all living things, sequoia is perhaps the only one able to wait long enough to make sure of being struck by lightning. So far as I am able to see at present, only fire and the axe threaten the existence of these noblest of God's trees. In nature's keeping they are safe, but through the agency of man destruction is making rapid progress, while in the work of protection only a good beginning has been made. The Fresno Grove, the Tuolumne, Merced and Mariposa groves, are under the protection of the federal government in the Yosemite National Park. So are the General Grant and Sequoia National Parks. The latter, established 21 years ago, has an area of 240 square miles and is efficiently guarded by a troop of cavalry under the direction of the Secretary of the Interior. So also are the small General Grant National Park, established at the same time with an area of 4 square miles, and the Mariposa Grove, about the same size, and the small Merced and Tuolumne group. Perhaps more than half of all the big trees have been thoughtlessly sold and are now in the hands of speculators and mill men. It appears, therefore, that far the largest and important section of protected big trees is in the great Sequoia National Park, now easily accessible by rail to Lemon Cove, and thence by a good stage road into the giant forest of the Kaweah, and thence by rail to other parts of the park. But large as it is, it should be made much larger. Its natural eastern boundary is the High Sierra and the northern and southern boundaries are the Kings and Kern rivers. Thus could be included the sublime scenery on the headwaters of these rivers and perhaps 9/10 of all the big trees in existence. All private claims within these bounds should be gradually extinguished by purchase by the government. The big tree, leaving all its higher uses out of the count, is a tree of life to the dwellers of the plain dependent on irrigation, a never-failing spring, sending living waters to the lowland. For every grove cut down a stream is dried up. Therefore all California is crying, "Save the trees of the fountains." Nor, judging by the signs of the times, is it likely that the cry will cease until the salvation of all that is left of Sequoia gigantea is made sure. End of Chapter 7. The Big Trees.